Next, in the inductive process, as we're looking at step number 2 in this introduction, we'll look at the outline. And so this is step number 2. And if you're familiar with, for example, a high school or college paper, how you'll create an outline for your paper. Of course, that's based on the information you're putting in, but the principle is basically still the same, where you're giving a structure to the information that is in the document. And so also with the Bible, we can create an outline of the Bible to help us understand the bigger picture of the biblical passages. And so let's start off by looking at structure levels in the Bible. Now, we've already looked at in a previous topic about the Old Testament and New Testament and what the portions are in the various parts of the Bible, and how there's, poetic portions, there's history portions, and various things like that. But now we're going to look at below that level, at the book level. And so looking at the structure levels in the Bible, of course, we've got the whole Bible. And then when you go down to individual Bible books, and then below an individual Bible book, if you think about it, you can ask yourself, what's below a Bible book? Well, usually there's chapters, verses, sentences, phrases, and words. But if we're going to add in our outline levels, the next one below a book would be major divisions. And so major divisions, this is kind of an arbitrary term that we've invented, that we call it this, but it's hopefully pretty transparent to what it's talking about, that it's talking about major pieces in a book. Portions that are just, you can tell it's just a big portion of the book is dedicated to this topic, and another portion is dedicated to this topic. That would be the idea of a major division. Below that, another term we use is sections. And so this would be below major divisions, but then these are smaller pieces that together make up the major divisions. And so sections are usually bigger than a chapter, and that would be the next portion, chapters. So usually several chapters will make up a section. And then below chapters, we have segments. And so segments are smaller than a chapter, but bigger than just one verse, usually several verses. And we'll get into that in a second here. And so below that, you've got verses. And then after verses, you've got sentences, and then phrases, and then words. The outline, however, typically consists of at least those three main parts: major divisions, sections, and also segments. And so let's take a deeper look at all of those three aspects. Firstly, with regards to major divisions, let me give a brief definition of that. A major division is a group of related events, stories, or ideas which divide the book into large parts. You could even say that it's a group of groups, because we'll say that the sections are also a group of related events. This is a group of groups. So it's a big group. And it divides the book into large pieces. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this inside 1 Samuel. So if you're still kind of confused by that, don't worry. You'll understand it in a moment when we look at an example in 1 Samuel. Next, you have sections. Now, sections are a unique group of related ideas, events, stories, or related ideas within the major division. So they're underneath the major divisions, and there could be several sections in one major division, and they're a unique group of related stories, events, or ideas. Again, this will hopefully become very clear when we look at 1 Samuel. A section is usually bigger than a chapter. It's important to remember that. For segments, this is usually one event, minor story, teaching, or something like that is related to the theme of the section in which it's found. So it's one event, one minor story, one teaching. And so that's something that you can think about when you're thinking through segments later on when we do our segment outline, is that you're just looking for one event. You're not looking for multiple events, you're looking for one event. And the key questions will help us in that aspect when we're thinking about the who, what, where, when, and usually just the who, what, where, when for outlining. We're thinking about, is there a change in character? Is there a change in event? Is there a change in place? Is there a change in time? And that will help us through that as we think about events and minor stories, and then even teachings if it's something that's not a narrative. Now, a segment is usually smaller than a chapter, and generally not smaller than about 5 to 10 verses. I can't give an exact amount because it's not like an exact science. The segment is always 7 verses. You can't say that. It depends on what the content is. And so you always want to make sure that you're doing justice to the content, not just trying to follow some rule or something. It is usually smaller than a chapter. I won't say all the time, but usually smaller than a chapter, but usually not much smaller than 5 to 10 verses. If it's that small, it's probably a subsegment already, if you want to include a subsegment as just a part of a story. That's another way that you could do it. And I'll give you an example of that as we go along. So let me next go along to an example of 1 Samuel and looking first at the segment. So 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 11. I'm going to look at this and break this portion down into segments. So segment number 1, and if you want to even pause and go read this story, that's up to you. I'll let you do that so that you can see where I'm going with this, or you can have the text open and look at this. But I'm just going to go through this and not read the text yet, but just give you the outline. So verses 1 through 7 is a description of Hannah's family situation. She's barren, loved, but teased. So she's barren. She's not able to have children. That's told to us in the story. Then she's loved. The story tells us about how her husband loves her so much, even though she's barren. And also she's teased because her husband has 2 wives, and that other wife really teases her because Hannah's not able to have kids, but this other wife is able to have kids. And so that's kind of a description of Hannah's family situation. That's what it's like at home for her. Then in verses 8 through 18, we see that Hannah seeks the Lord while at Shiloh out of bitterness of soul. So while they're there at Shiloh, they're trying to have a feast, and Hannah just can't eat. She goes to the tabernacle. She's praying to the Lord before the tabernacle. Even gets accused of being drunk because she's, her mouth is moving, but she's not saying anything. So high priest Eli thought she was drunk. That whole story. And so it gives that whole story. And then the priest actually says, hey, you're going to have a baby. So then in verses 19 through 28, Hannah receives Samuel, weans him, and gives him back to the Lord. And that segment has all of those aspects inside of it. I kind of would like to break it down into those smaller pieces, but it seems like all those aspects are put together in this portion to give us a wider view of things. Now in verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2, we have Hannah's prayer of rejoicing over the Lord's greatness and what the Lord did for her in giving her a son. And then we have a very small segment, verse 11, which, again, I said most of the time it's not smaller than 5 verses, but in this case, it seems like it is. And so Samuel stays at Shiloh, and that's a very significant aspect. That's why I have it as its own segment, because it's a very significant aspect that Samuel now is staying at Shiloh and not going home anymore to his family and to his mother Hannah. And so that would be the segments for this portion. Now, I'm going to colorize those in green so that you can have a distinction when I show you the other parts. Now, it's possible to even add into this subsegments. Now, I didn't put subsegments on that graphic we had earlier where it's almost like a staircase of the different levels of the outline. I didn't include subsegments because I don't really want you to be confused. I don't want you to think you have to put them in, but I want to show you here that it's a possibility. It depends on you and how deep you want to go with your outline. So let me just add in the subsegments here. So this is inside that first segment. Inside verses 1 through 7, you can break it down to verses 1 through 2, verses 3 through 5, and verses 6 through 7. So you can have 3 pieces inside that first segment. So it's kind of like having a pizza, and that first segment is the pizza, and then cutting that pizza into 3 big, gigantic slices. That would be like what it's doing. You're not removing anything. You're not using a different you're not using a different amount of verses. These are all inside verses 1 through 7, but they're 3 individual pieces. So the first one is description of Elkanah's family, description of Elkanah's love for God and family, and then the description of Hannah's provocation by her rival. So those are the subsegments that you could put in there, but I don't want to focus on that too much, just showing you what's possible. But segments are the one you're generally going to be focused on. Again, a segment is usually one story, one event, or one topic. And this really is almost topical in the sense that it gives the whole picture of Hannah's family situation, barren, loved, and teased. And we're kind of getting a background on her family, especially with Elkanah as the husband in that house. And so we've got those sub-segments there. Now I'm going to get rid of the sub-segments, and I'm going to replace, and I'm going to go up instead of going down. I went down to the sub-segments. Now I'm going to go up to above segments and add in sections. Now, all of these segments that we've been looking at can all be part of one section, and that section is the background story, Hannah and the miraculous birth of Samuel. So this is all about the background story for Samuel. As we'll see in a second here, this is underneath the major division that's all about Samuel. And this portion is the background story for Samuel's birth. Samuel was an important leader in Israel, and so it gives the background of how he was born, that he was really a miracle baby because his mother was barren. She couldn't have children until she prayed and sought the Lord and committed to give him back to the Lord. And then once you see that, then once the Lord saw that, then he gave Samuel to Hannah, and then she gave him ultimately back to the Lord. And so we see the background story for the birth of Samuel. So that's the section that all of these segments are inside of. Chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 11. And you can see there's 5 portions of that section. That section is divided into 5 portions or 5 segments. Now you can go even further and say, well, first of all, you can say after that, there are more sections in the book of Samuel. For example, you can say in verses chapter 2, 12 through chapter 4, 1a, that's the rise of Samuel as prophet over Israel. And inside of that, you'll have several different stories that show that overall theme. Then in chapter 4, verse 1b through chapter 7, verse 2, you have dealings with the Philistines during the time of Eli. And that's significant to Samuel's story because that shows how Samuel is going to inherit a mess when he becomes the leader and ruler of Israel as the judge. Then you've got 1 Samuel 7, 3 through 17, which is kind of a small section. That's smaller than a chapter. Again, I did say most of the time it's not smaller than a chapter. In this case, it is. And in this case, it's Samuel's rise to lead as judge over all Israel. Then you've got another piece, chapter 8 through chapter 12. And in this one, Samuel leads Israel as they transition from judges to kings. And so that's all about the history of when Samuel was older and how the people wanted to get a king instead of just having a judge. And the Lord allowed that to happen, and he used Samuel to warn the people, but then also used Samuel to bring about the rise of the kingship through anointing Saul, the first king. But Samuel's still in charge in this whole time. And so these are the sections that continue out and finish out the story of the prophet and judge Samuel. Now you can go up another level into major divisions above sections, and that's what we'll do next, and see that all of these sections, chapter 1 through chapter 12, those 5 sections, A, B, C, D, E, and A, B, C, D, and E, that they're all part of a major division. And that major division is all about Samuel, the life and ministry of Samuel as judge and prophet. And that's really the defining factor that groups all of these together. They're all about Samuel. The first one is about Samuel's backstory, about his birth, then his rise as prophet over Israel, and then the issue with the Philistines that it actually gave him the ability to become the leader because Eli died during that time. And you got Samuel's rise to leadership as judge. Then you've got Samuel leading Israel to the transition to the monarchy. And so it's the whole life and ministry of Samuel as judge and prophet. And so that's a major division. It's 12 chapters long. It's a huge piece of the book of 1 Samuel. In addition, you could add additional major divisions. Number 2, you could have this one is titled Saul, reign as God's anointed king over the nation of Israel, and that would be chapters 13 through 15. Then additionally, you could say David and Saul, the anointed king and the earthly king, and that's chapters 16 through 20. If you've read the book of 1 Samuel, you know that during that time, after chapter 15, the Lord was done with Saul because Saul had disobeyed him so many times that the Lord said, I'm done with you. I've removed you from being the king. And so David comes into the picture. We see that a chapter after that is where chapter 16 is where David's anointed. Chapter 17 is David and Goliath, and you're starting to see the story be more about David, but Saul is still in the picture, and Saul is still trying to even later on hunt David down and do things to him, but not quite yet. At this point, it's kind of in between Saul and David. Remember, the Spirit was upon David, but had left Saul, and so that's why Saul was all actually, not only just bitter, but he was also broken, and he also was just really messed up. And that's why David would play the harp for him, if you remember back in that story, if you've read that book before. And so there's this contrast between the two of them throughout this portion about David as the anointed king and Saul as the earthly king. And then lastly, the last portion of the book of 1 Samuel, the last major division, is David the fugitive king in chapters 21 through 31. And during this entire time, the story is mostly focused on David, but focused on David as he's trying to run away and escape the wrath of Saul, who's trying to actively kill him during this portion of the book. But it's mainly focused on David. You'll still see Saul throughout this portion, but it's mainly focused on David, whereas the previous ones were David and Saul, and then Saul before that. And so these are the major divisions, and inside each of these major divisions you can have multiple sections, and inside of each of those sections you can have multiple segments. And so those three categories, major divisions, sections, and segments, are the three levels that you should have in your outline. You can even go further down and add in subsegments if you really want to, although I don't recommend getting too detailed. I love outlining, and so in my outlines, I've got 7 different levels at times, and really complicated books, really big books that are complicated, but I don't recommend getting too detailed. Like, you don't need to go down to individual verses most of the time unless it's very significant, like it was in chapter 2 verse 11, but most of the time you're going to stick with the segment level and not the subsegment level, and that will help you not spend too much time on this. Of course, later on, as you go through your ministry, if you've done it well, you can add in additional levels if you feel that it's necessary, and then that will help you even more later on in your ministry. But for now, just do major division, sections, and segments. Now let's look at keys to outlining, or things to look for when outlining. Number 1, look for changes in scene. Now, this will often include changes in characters, events, locations, and time, and this is the most reliable indication of a change in segment. If you think about a movie, you know when there's a different scene because it usually you have a cut scene. Usually there's some kind of a cut scene that happens inside the movie, and then you'll know it's a different scene because you've either got different characters, if you've got like a multi-character movie, or like, for example, Lord of the Rings, where you've got the two different parties. You've got, Aragorn and, like, let's say the second Lord of the Rings, you've got Aragorn and Legolas hunting for the orcs, and then you've got Merry and Pippin, and then otherwise you've got Sam and Frodo, and you've just got different characters, and so it's got a change in scenes. And in each of those scenes, it's usually a different character, or who, remember the who question, different events, or the what. It's got different locations, different where, and different time, which is the when question. And so you've got changes in those aspects. And if you've got just a minor change, for example, it's still the same person, still the same major event, still the same location, but it's a different time, then you might be looking at a subsegment. But if it's a change in 2 of those, maybe still the same character, same event, but you've got a different location and a different time, maybe you're looking at a change in segment. And if you've got 3 or more, well, maybe that's even a change in section, or even a change in major division. Notice with 1 Samuel, you'd have the major characters would change from from one major division to the next. No longer is it about Samuel. You don't see him too much anymore in the text. You now see Saul in the text. He's mentioned all the time. Samuel's mentioned, but he's just not the main character. You don't see that the story revolves around him anymore. And so look for changes in scene, especially based off of the who, what, where, when principles, those key questions that you can use as a tool to determine when things are changing. And again, this is the most reliable indication of change in segments, especially for Old Testament narratives. Additionally, look for thematic changes. Now, this will often include changes in topic and may be observed through keyword changes. And so sometimes you'll see that there's a different keyword that is in one place, but it's not in another place as you're going through the book. Maybe it's not in the next chapter, so maybe there's a change there. Look also for transition words. Now, this is good in the Old Testament, but it's much better actually in the New Testament. The key transition words are a lot clearer in the New Testament than they are in the Old Testament. Although they are still there, and those can help you know when a change is coming, it's more effective to use this key in the New Testament than in the Old Testament. Number 4, look for that was number 3. Look for transition words. So the words then, now, and when can sometimes indicate a new segment or a new subsegment. Additionally, number 4, look for repeated words or phrases. Now, there will be times where a word or phrase is repeated to give emphasis to the main idea of the segment, section, or major division, and that will help you understand, that you're still in the same part of the book. For example, there's 2 main parts to the book of Judges. The first part, which is the historical portion that just talks to you in a linear fashion about the various judges. Okay, then there was this judge, then there was this judge, and then there was this judge. That ends with Samson. Now, after Samson, that's not the end of the book of Judges, and there are still stories that are being told, but it starts off with saying, now in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then you hear story after story of terrible, wicked things that were going on during that time. And then you start to see, oh, wow, this is stories that happened during the time of the judges. So it's helping us understand what life looked like during the time of the judges. And then that same phrase is repeated at the very end of that portion, at the end of the entire book of Judges. And it says, in those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's at the beginning and end. And so you can see those repeated words or phrases. Another passage is for example, in the book of Romans. When you're looking at chapter 7, you see a lot of the word law. You also see a lot of the word I, the personal pronoun I. Of course, it's actually part of the verb sometimes in the original Greek, but you see a lot of it in the English translation. And you see just a lot about himself, about Paul. He's talking about himself. Then, when you get to chapter 8, it's mostly focused on the Holy Spirit, and so you start to see by these repeated words or phrases that there's a different focus in chapter 8 than there was in chapter 7, and so sometimes repeated words or phrases will give you an idea. You can count them up if you want. That's also a possibility, but maybe even just in reading, when you're thinking about that, the idea of key words or phrases, you can start to see it, and then you're like, okay, there's definitely a break here because this is changing when you get right here to this spot. So those are some keys to outlining, some things to look for as you're beginning the outline process. So let me give you some instructions for your first assignment, which is outlining Ruth 2, verse 1 through 2, and then the other ones have additional details that you can see inside the assignment. So first of all, number 1, read the whole book of Ruth, which isn't that easy, isn't that hard. It's just 4 chapters, so read the whole book first. Number 2, identify and write down a basic theme for the book of Ruth and then revise as necessary. So you'll see this in the assignment. Just read through the book of Ruth and then write down a basic theme. What do you think the main theme of the book of Ruth is? And it's okay. Don't spend like 5 hours on this. Just try and say what you think it is, and then we'll talk about it later on. Now, number 3, identify the major details for each scene. Now, this is only for this assignment, for the first 2 chapters of Ruth 2. This is not something that you're going to do every single time you outline the scriptures. I'm just having you do it for this first outlining assignment so that you can get used to identifying these details in your head, and then it will become common practice for you to think about while you're outlining. So identify the major details of each scene for each segment. So you're going to identify the characters, or the who. You're going to identify events, situations, or themes, which is the what. And then you're going to identify locations, which is the where, and then time, which is the when. And so you're going to use those to help you as you're creating titles for the various portions, and also as you're breaking down the text. Number 4, segment titling. Read and reread the text and give an appropriate title to each segment. So when you're looking at each segment, that is, you've said, okay, these 4 verses go together. Okay, now you're going to give a title to that segment right there. What is this all about? So reread the text and give an appropriate title to each segment. Now, titles should be kept as brief as possible, meaning to say it shouldn't be that long, while still conveying enough information to cover the major idea of the verses in the segment. I would suggest it not being longer than a sentence, and probably not shorter than a good-sized phrase. Probably if you can have maybe a phrase at least maybe with 1 comma in it as you give some of the details in it, it should probably be enough. We'll talk about titles as we go through this. Now, it is often helpful to include some of the major details in your titles, as they will give you a more accurate understanding of the segment. So the who, the what, the where, the when. Include the answers to those questions inside the segment title, as that will help you with the main idea of the passage. So let's look at an outline creation example. And again, this is from your assignment. This is going to hopefully look exactly like your assignment. Hopefully there's no formatting issues. But this is what it looks like. So you'll start off with a theme, read the whole book, then put in the theme. And then this is the first portion in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. This is the first segment. It's a little bit of a small segment. Some people would say this is more like sub-segment size, but it's okay. We're just practicing right now. If you want, you can disagree with me later on. Now, what I'd normally have you do is read through this passage and identify the major characters, the major events, situations, location, and then the time. But I've already done that for you below. If you can see there at the bottom below the text, you've got for the main characters Elimelech, and I put an M next to his name as I believe he's the main character. And also I put a plus at the beginning of his name because this is the first time we see him. Of course, it's the beginning of the story, so first time we see everyone. So you've got Naomi, you've got Mahlon, you've got Chilion. Then under the events or situation, there's a famine, and then there's also the travel of Elimelech's family to Moab. Now, this is an observation down below, so I'm not putting exact quotes on it. I'm just filling in some information from the passage. Also, the location, Judah of Benjamin, and then also we have Moab, and I would suggest that Moab is the main country for purposes of understanding the text. Now, also you have the time of the judges, and then non-specific time. So the whole book is set in the time of the judges, but it's not really specific to, what part of the year it is when they left. We don't really know. It could be that it's around harvest time because there's a famine, because there's no food. It's possible. We don't know necessarily for sure, though, or at least it's not clear from the text. So that's an example of that. Now I want to go on to another one. You've got Elimelech, Naomi's husband, and then this whole thing. Now, what I ask in the in-person classes is I'll ask you to take 2 minutes and come up with a title for this. So why don't you pause the video for 2 minutes, think about a title, and then come back and restart the video or play the video after you've thought through this passage. So go ahead, pause the video, and then read the passage and give a good title. Remember to include as much of that information as you can that's below the passage in order to make it a good, meaty title. But again, not too long, not too much. Definitely not more than a sentence. Okay. If you're back, now I'll give you my outline title for this one. My outline title is Elimelech and family travel to Moab to flee a famine. Simple. It's not very complicated, but it just gives the idea of the whole passage. Elimelech and family, you could name them if you want, but there is family. Elimelech and family travel to Moab to escape a famine. You could even include during the time of the judges if you want to. Just don't make it too wordy. If it goes off the end of the screen, then it's too wordy. So just make sure it's not more than a sentence. Now we could get another segment here. This is verses 3 through 5, 3, 4, and 5. And so we've got a few verses here. Now I'll ask you to do the same thing. Go ahead and look at all these details and read the passage. Take 2 minutes to do that and then come up with a title. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video. All right, now that you're back, well, let me look at the characters and all the other details with you. So we've got Naomi. Now, I've listed Naomi as the main character. Why? Because even in the beginning, in verse 3, Elimelech is described as Naomi's husband. Before it was Naomi was Elimelech's wife. Now it's Elimelech is Naomi's husband because, of course, in this passage he dies. So he's no longer the main character. Naomi's the main character. Elimelech, you see I put a minus sign in front of his name because he's taken out. He's gone. Of course, we have two additional characters. We have Orpah, and Ruth. And that's why I've got the plus there. But also Mahlon and Chilion died, so I've got the minus signs next to their name. But the only character who is consistent throughout this passage is Naomi. So that's why I consider her to be the main character. In addition, you've got various events and situations. You've got the death of Elimelech. Then you've got marriage, Orpah and Ruth to Mahlon and Chilion. And then you have more death, where her two sons die. For the location, it's only in Moab at this point, so that's the main location. And then the time, we know that by the end of the segment, it is 10 years after the end of segment 1. We don't know very many definite details, but we know it's been 10 years, which is quite a large amount of time. And that's something that is interesting for interpretation, especially when you go back to the initial statements about Elimelech and his family moving to Moab. And I would suggest looking it up in a couple of different translations so that you can see. So how would you title this one? For me, I would, you could say it's something like Moab's husband and sons die while in Moab. You could say it's something like that. Naomi experiences loss in Moab and during her 10-year stay in Moab. Naomi loses Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion during her 10-year stay in Moab, something like that. You could also include that she gained 2 daughters, Orpah and Ruth. But the primary idea of this passage is loss, of the death of her husband and 2 sons. That's the primary thing that you see there. It's almost like Orpah and Ruth are kind of an afterthought. They're not really focused on much during this period. At least not yet in this passage. They will be in further passages. And so I don't know what your title is. You can share with me later, and I'm sure that I will be able to look at your titles, and I'll grade your titles when you give them through your assignments. But I hope that makes sense to you. Of course, if you have any questions, you can ask me, and I'll try and help you through this process of outlining. If you need to, go back and watch the video again and look at the examples again. And of course, you're more than welcome to ask me questions as well.